Eddie Albert. You might know him from Green Acres, playing the city lawyer who trades his comfortable life for a broken-down farm. But his real story? Way bigger. Way crazier. He wasn't just an actor. He was a war hero, a spy, a man who lost everything more than once and still fought his way back. So how did a kid from a struggling family become a Hollywood star? How did he end up dodging bullets in the Pacific and saving lives under enemy fire? And after everything, why did he walk away from fame to fight for something even bigger? Let's start at the beginning. Eddie Albert wasn't even born with that name. He came into the world as Edward Albert Heimberger on April 22, 1906, in Rock Island, Illinois. But right from the start, things were complicated. His parents weren't married when he was born, and his mother later changed his birth certificate after their wedding. By the time he was 1, his family packed up and moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And if you think life got easier, think again. They didn't have money, so Eddie had to work, at just 6 years old. While other kids were playing, he was out delivering newspapers, braving freezing winters and scorching summers. For 10 years he did this. 10 years of waking up early, running through the streets and making money because his family needed it. But there was a price. He grew up feeling isolated, like he didn't quite fit in. Then came World War I, and if having to work from childhood wasn't hard enough, having a German last name during the war made things even worse. Kids at school called him the enemy. They taunted him, bullied him. But instead of breaking him, it made him tougher. He learned to push through, to keep moving no matter what. By 1926, Eddie graduated high school and went to the University of Minnesota. He had a plan. Study business, get a stable job, build a successful life. But life doesn't care about plans. The stock market crash of 1929 wiped everything out. Businesses collapsed. Banks failed. Suddenly, there were no jobs, no security, no future. And Eddie, he was left with nothing. So what did he do? He hustled. He took any job he could find. Trapeze performer, insurance salesman, nightclub singer. Whatever paid the bills, he did it. And then, completely by accident, he found acting. In 1933, Eddie made his way to New York City. No money, no connections, just a willingness to work. That's when he landed a job on the Honeymooners Grace and Eddie Show, a radio sitcom that ran for 3 years. He and his co-star, Grace Bratt, had such good chemistry that people actually thought they were married. Then Broadway came calling. He landed a role in Brother Rat, and suddenly Warner Brothers took notice. They offered him a film contract, but there was one problem: his last name. Nobody could pronounce Heimberger right. He got tired of hearing hamburger, so he dropped it. From then on, he was Eddie Albert. Hollywood took him in, and for a while it looked like he had made it. He starred in movies like Brother Rat and On Your Toes, working alongside actors who would later become legends. But just as his career was taking off, the world changed again. Before the U.S. officially entered World War II, Eddie took a trip to Mexico. On the surface, he was just performing, doing high-wire acts, clown routines, entertaining crowds. But in reality, he was working for the U.S. Army. His real job was spying on German U-boats in Mexican harbors. He was taking photos, gathering intelligence, pretending to be just another American performer while secretly sending information back to the government. If he had been caught, he wouldn't have made it home. But spying wasn't enough. In 1942, he officially enlisted in the U.S. Coast Guard, and by 1943, he was a lieutenant in the U.S. Naval Reserve. That's when he was sent to the Pacific, and into one of the bloodiest battles of the war. November 1943, the Battle of Tarawa. If you've never heard of it, here's what you need to know. It was brutal. The U.S. was trying to take an island heavily defended by Japanese forces. Marines were being cut down as they tried to land. Machine guns, mortars, chaos everywhere. And in the middle of it, Eddie Albert. He wasn't on the front lines with a rifle. Instead, he was piloting a Navy landing craft. His mission was to get troops onto the beach, but when he saw Marines stranded in the water under heavy fire with no way to move forward or back, he made a choice. Under a hail of bullets, Eddie steered his boat into the danger zone, rescued 47 stranded Marines, and directed the rescue of 30 more. He saved 77 lives that day. For his bravery, he was awarded the Bronze Star with Combat V, one of the highest military honors. But to him, it wasn't about medals. It was about the men who made it home because of him. Eddie came back different. The war had shown him what really mattered. Fame, money, they weren't enough. He kept acting because he was good at it, because it paid the bills. He starred in movies like Smash Up, The Story of a Woman, and worked steadily in Hollywood. But behind the scenes, he started something else, Eddie Albert Productions. He wasn't just making movies, he was making educational and industrial films, using his skills to teach people, to spread awareness, to make a difference. Still, Hollywood wasn't done with him yet. The 1950s were coming and television was about to explode. And Eddie Albert? He was about to step into his very first TV series. In 1952, he landed the lead role in Leave It to Larry, a lighthearted sitcom about a shoe salesman who couldn't escape his father-in-law, at home or at work. It seemed like the perfect setup for a hit, but things didn't go as planned. The show lasted just 2 months before being pulled off the air. A rough start, but Albert didn't let it slow him down. CBS still believed in him, and in 1953, they gave him his own variety show, The Eddie Albert Show. This was a different kind of challenge, hosting, singing, and keeping an audience entertained for an entire program. He had energy, charisma, and talent, but critics weren't convinced. One review called him all thumbs, saying he looked uncomfortable on camera. Not exactly a glowing endorsement, but Albert didn't dwell on bad press. He kept moving. The next year, he found himself on Saturday Night Review, replacing Your Show of Shows on NBC. This was primetime television, a big stage, and Albert was right in the middle of it. The show had comedy, music, and sketches, with a lineup that included Ben Blue, Alan Young, and the Sauter-Finnegan Orchestra. He was proving that even if one show failed, there was always another door waiting to open. And while television was pulling him in, Hollywood wasn't letting him go. He kept landing film roles, balancing both worlds like few actors could. He played a charming fiancé opposite Lucille Ball in The Fuller Brush Girl. He earned his first Academy Award nomination for Roman Holiday, holding his own against Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck. In Oklahoma, he played a smooth-talking peddler who could sell anything. He even took on more intense roles, like a paranoid military officer in Attack, a character so unstable and dangerous that it left audiences rattled. He didn't just stick to the big screen, though. He was bouncing between television dramas, stage productions, and movie sets, always pushing himself to try something new. In 1953, he starred as Winston Smith in the very first television adaptation of 1984, bringing George Orwell's dystopian nightmare to life for audiences who had never seen anything like it. One week he was acting in a gritty war film, the next he was on the Pat Boone Chevy showroom or guest starring in Studio One. Broadway still called to him, and he returned for roles in Miss Liberty and The 7-Year Itch. In 1960, he took over the lead in The Music Man, stepping into the shoes of Harold Hill, the fast-talking con-man-turned-showman. Even as television was growing, even as movies kept demanding his time, Albert made sure the stage was still part of his career. He wasn't slowing down. If anything, he was speeding up. He performed in Reuben in Boston, then took his talents to the Muni Theater in St. Louis, where he played Alfred P. Doolittle in My Fair Lady. And then came the strangest role of all. In 1964, he appeared in an episode of The Outer Limits called Cry of Silence. It started like any other science fiction story. A couple moves to a remote valley, only to find themselves under attack. But the enemies weren't aliens or evil scientists. They were tumbleweeds and frogs and flying rocks. It was ridiculous, but Albert played it completely straight, selling every moment like his life truly depended on it. Maybe that's why it worked. At this point, he had done just about everything. He had played heroes and villains, comedians and con men. He had hosted shows, sung on stage, and been nominated for an Oscar. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. In 1965, CBS offered him a sitcom that sounded completely absurd. A wealthy New York lawyer decides to leave the city behind and move to the countryside to become a farmer. That was the pitch. A fish-out-of-water comedy that paired Albert with Hungarian actress Eva Gabor as his glamorous, bewildered wife. The show was called Green Acres. It sounded ridiculous, but Albert saw something in it. Maybe it was the sharp writing. Maybe it was the chemistry with Gabor. Or maybe it was the talking pig. Whatever it was, he said yes. And just like that, he became Oliver Wendell Douglas, the straight-laced city man trying and failing to adjust to life on the farm. The show was a hit. By the end of its first season, it was one of the most popular series on television. The comedy came from its bizarre mix of realism and surrealism. Some characters acted normal, while others existed in their own cartoonish world. A cow named Eleanor got fan mail. A pig named Arnold stole every scene he was in. And Albert, he played the exasperated straight man perfectly, reacting to the madness around him with increasing frustration. It lasted 6 seasons, running for 170 episodes. Fans loved it. Critics respected it. And Albert, he embraced it. He wasn't just playing a farmer on TV. He started growing his own organic food in real life. He worked with universities to develop sustainable farming models. His passion for conservation grew, and soon Green Acres wasn't just a sitcom, it was a launching pad for his real-life environmental activism. Then, in 1971, it all ended. CBS decided it wanted younger urban viewers, and in what became known as the Rural Purge, they canceled Green Acres, the Beverly Hillbillies, Petticoat Junction, and nearly every other show set outside a big city. Albert wasn't happy about it. He felt the network was turning its back on millions of loyal viewers. But there was nothing he could do. The show was over. For most actors, a sitcom cancellation would mark the beginning of the end. Not for Albert. He kept going. He landed another TV series, Switch, where he played a retired cop who teams up with a former con man to run a detective agency. He took on dramatic guest roles in Columbo and Murder, she wrote. He even returned to the world of Green Acres in 1990 for a reunion special with Eva Gabor. He had built a career that spanned radio, television, film, and theater. He had won awards, starred in hit shows, and proven that he could play just about any role. He had served his country in war, saved lives under fire, and used his fame to fight for causes he believed in. But just when he thought he had seen it all, Hollywood turned on him in a way he never expected. His name became tangled in one of the most controversial moments in entertainment history. It was the 1950s, the height of Cold War paranoia. Fear of communism spread like wildfire, and Hollywood became a battleground. Anyone with suspected left-wing ties was under scrutiny. Careers were ruined overnight. Some were jailed. Others took their own lives. And Eddie Albert? His name landed on the list. Not because of anything he did. Not because he was a communist, but because of his wife, Mexican actress Margot. She was outspoken, passionate. She believed in fighting against fascism and injustice. But in 1950, that was enough to get her labeled as a communist sympathizer. She had attended an anti-Franco rally. That was it. That was all it took. The backlash was immediate. People spat at her in the streets. She needed a bodyguard just to feel safe. And Albert? Studios suddenly saw him as a risk. For the first time in his life, he was unemployable. This was a man who had fought for his country, who had saved lives at Tarawa, who had been awarded the Bronze Star, and yet none of that seemed to matter. He was blacklisted, locked out of the very industry he had worked so hard to succeed in. But Albert wasn't a man who gave up easily. His son later said that it was his father's war record that saved him. He was a decorated veteran, a war hero. Even Hollywood couldn't ignore that forever. Bit by bit, work started to come back, slowly. Studios took chances on him again. But while Albert recovered, Margot never did. The blacklist followed her. Work became scarce. A career that had once been promising was now in ruins. For years, Albert spoke about this period with deep sadness. He knew that some people never got their careers back. Some never got their lives back. Everyone was so full of fear, he once said. Many people couldn't support their families. Some even killed themselves. He had survived it, but he never forgot those who didn't. And that experience shaped the rest of his life. Albert didn't just act, he became an activist. He used his fame to fight for causes he believed in: environmentalism, hunger relief, conservation. He wasn't just playing a farmer on green acres, he was out in the world, working with scientists to develop sustainable farming methods. He pushed for organic agriculture before it was trendy. He founded the Eddie Albert World Trees Foundation and became a national leader for the Boy Scouts conservation programs. TV Guide once called him an ecological Paul Revere. And that wasn't an exaggeration. He was a voice for change, a force. But his activism didn't stop there. He worked with the U.S. Council on Refugees. He joined Albert Schweitzer in a documentary about malnutrition in Africa. He spoke at the very first Earth Day in 1970. He fought against the use of DDT, warning people about the dangers of pesticides long before most people knew they existed. Even in Hollywood, he kept pushing. He produced educational films, tackling issues like human growth and sex education, subjects that no one wanted to touch at the time. Albert wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a fighter, a leader, and through it all, his personal life remained steady. He and Margot had married in 1945 and built a life together, raising 2 children, Edward Jr., who would later become an actor himself, and Maria, who managed her father's career. They lived in Pacific Palisades in a Spanish-style home with a cornfield out front. Albert grew his own vegetables in a greenhouse, a habit he had picked up from his parents during World War I. But in 1985, tragedy struck again. Margot was diagnosed with brain cancer. She died that same year. They had been married for 40 years. Albert never remarried. Losing Margot was a blow, but he kept going. His career stretched into the 80s and 90s. He played the President of the United States in Dreamscape. He guest-starred in Murder, She Wrote. He even returned to Green Acres one last time for a reunion movie in 1990, standing once again beside Eva Gabor. But time was catching up. In 1995, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. It was a cruel irony. One of the sharpest minds in Hollywood was slowly fading. His son, Edward Jr., put his own acting career on hold to care for him. Even as his memory slipped away, Albert stayed active. He exercised daily. He walked in his garden. He lived to see the new millennium. But in 2005, at the age of 99, pneumonia took him. He was buried in Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery next to Margot and near his Green Acres co-star Eva Gabor. A fitting place for a man whose career had spanned generations, who had entertained millions, who had lived not just as an actor, but as a hero. He had been a war veteran, a Broadway star, an Oscar-nominated actor, a sitcom legend, an environmental activist, and a humanitarian. He had lost everything more than once, but he had never stopped fighting. A star who lost everything in his life, but lived like a hero. What do you think of Eddie Albert's incredible life? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the lives of Hollywood's greatest legends.